I'll introduce myself. Celeste Hornbach. I'm the Director of Housing Policy with the New York City Comptroller's Office. I'm excited for y'all to see our panel today. We have a set of 3 really great panelists. We're going to learn a little bit about social housing. What is it? How is it sort of generally being defined? What are some examples of social housing in New York City already? And what are some sort of policy pathways that CSS has identified that can help us expand the social housing sector. And then Brianna from East New York CLT is going to dig a little bit deeper into one type of social housing, an alternative form of land tenure. A lot of people are probably familiar with community land trusts. Brianna is going to explain to them and kind of talk about the organizing work that East New York CLT is bringing to bring land out of the speculative market. And then we're going to hear from Monica Dean and Deacon Stephen Robinson, both about the LISC program, the NILAP program that helps churches or faith institutions, work with affordable housing developers to develop housing on vacant lots that they may own. So with that, I'll get us started. I'll kick it over to Sam. I'm going to share my screen. Just one second.
Great. Thanks a lot, Celeste. Everybody can hear me? Great. So my name is Sam Stein, and I am a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society. Community Service Society, or CSS, is a approximately 175-year-old organization that serves to improve life for low-income New Yorkers, both through direct service work and through policy advocacy. And housing has been a focus for CSS really since the beginning. And for a very long time now, we've been a leader on chronicling New York's social housing and calling for even more. Social housing may be a new term for some folks, and so I want to get into what we mean. It really dovetails closely with the name of this session, Housing for the Public Good. Social housing is a term that's used really around the world, sometimes in dramatically different ways, but generally to describe housing that has the following 3 characteristics to greater or lesser extents. The first is decommodification. That's a long word for making housing about quality, not profit. If you look at the word, it has commodity in the middle of it. A commodity is an object that is produced, bought, and sold for profit. We want housing not to operate like that. We want to build and support housing that is there in good times and bad for the market. So it doesn't get gentrified when the market is hot. It doesn't become disinvested when the market is cool. And where one lucky person can't make a windfall profit off of changes to their neighborhood that will negatively impact everybody else. So that's decommodification. There's a lot of different types of decommodified housing, and I'll get into some of those models in a moment. The second pillar of social housing is social equality, which first and foremost means basically affordability, but broad affordability, broad and deep. So it is accessible to the lowest income folks who are right now not very well served by the housing market in New York, but it's also open to most New Yorkers. So it's not a severely and very tightly means-tested program in the way that some can be. Social equality also means equality within a housing development. So if it's mixed income, to ensure that low-income and high-income people have access to all the same amenities and spaces and types of apartments. And also equality between social housing and maybe it's not so social neighbors. So if there's a social housing development on a block and the same block has private rental housing, the standard should be more or less the same. There shouldn't be any stigma attached to living in the social housing as opposed to the private housing. That's social equality. The third pillar is resident control or resident democracy. What this means is some way of making sure that the people who live in social housing determine both how it's managed in a day-to-day way and also its future. So that could mean a cooperative where the residents vote on elected leaders who do both the day-to-day operations and make important long-term decisions. It could be a nonprofit that has on its board the residents of the housing who live in the housing that it owns. It could be an elected residents association, like in public housing, but we'd love to see them have much more structural power in terms of how the housing is run. So those are the three pillars of social housing: decommodification, social equality, and resident control. All right, so now we will talk about some of the models that exist already in New York. The good news is New York has social housing. We need a lot more of it. There are a lot of different models for social housing in New York, which range from public housing, where the government owns and operates the housing, to community land trusts, which we'll be hearing about a little bit more in the East New York context, to Mitchell-Lama cooperatives and rentals, which are state-supported social housing built in the middle of the 20th century, HDFCs, which are conversions of formerly for-profit rentals into not-for-profit limited equity cooperatives. These are all different kinds of models of social housing. As I said before, CSS has a history of working on promoting social housing in New York and beyond. And a few years ago, my close colleague, Oksana Mironova, and my departed friend and mentor, Tom Waters, made this grid, which explains kind of how social different social housing models are and compares them to not so social housing, or what I like to call anti-social housing. On this chart, you have three dimensions. On the vertical, on the far left, you see decommodification. So the higher it is on the scale, the most decommodified it is. The lower it is on the scale, the most commodified it is. Then on the left to the right, we have social equality. So on the far left, we have extremely unequal. And on the far right, we have the most egalitarian. The size of the dot is supposed to correspond to the level of resident control. So a big dot means people who live in it have a good deal of say over how it runs today and in the future. A small dot means maybe not so much. This is not meant to be set in stone, the end all be all. I think it's really a conversation starter. Some people might argue that some of these different housing models should be in different locations or have a different marker size. But that's good. We want it to spark discussion, and we want to get people to see that social housing, first of all, is not just one thing, that it's a spectrum and a continuum, that we have it already in New York, and that if we continue to develop models, we want them to be maximizing each of those three pillars: decommodification, social equality, and resident control. To get to that point where we have a whole lot more social housing, we can be building new social housing, which we strongly support, but we can also be converting existing for-profit housing into social housing model. And recently, the Community Service Society, along with Celeste at the Comptroller's office and our colleague Jacob Udell at the University Neighborhood Housing Program in the Bronx, wrote a large, I don't want to say comprehensive because it could always have more, but a pretty big compendium of policies that we argue should be combined and understood as pathways to social housing conversions in New York. The report exists as a PDF, which you can print out and read or read on a screen, but it's also an interactive website, and I'll put the link in the chat after I speak in a moment. We argue that there are kind of four big buckets of policies that would be useful in these social housing conversions. Perhaps the most straightforward is policies to promote democratic control of housing. And by the way, all these can be done at the local, state, or federal level. Some of them require capital budgets or operating budgets. Some are even budget positive or neutral. We get into all of that in the report. So democratic control of housing. Policies to enable groups of residents to take over housing that is currently in the private market, put it in the social housing market. Fairly straightforward. Financial resources, doing that takes money. So we need progressive taxes, and we need to be constantly budgeting for both the upkeep and the expansion of our social housing stock. We have 5 policies to do that. Then the kinds of housing justice work that we're already doing to a large scale, but thinking about them as means to promote social housing conversions. So expanding tenants' rights in various ways. Why is that important? First of all, to give tenants the power to collectively organize, both in their buildings and at the city, state, federal, and international level without fear of retribution. And also to make it impossible for landlords to evict tenants simply because, you know, they're quote unquote troublemakers who are organizing, or because they're protesting against unjust evictions or bad conditions. And that takes us to the final bucket, code enforcement and tools for safe conditions. We want to see a much stronger commitment to enforcing the upkeep of rental housing. And for landlords who are harassing tenants and or failing to keep up their buildings, we want a pathway to take the housing away from those most exploitative practices and put them in tenant control, either through a limited equity cooperative structure, a community land trust, a nonprofit, some form of social housing. So I will in a moment put the link to this report in the chat. I encourage you to read it after this panel, but it gives an idea of maybe how we get from here to there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. I'll pass it over to Brianna from the East New York CLT.
Thanks, Sam and Celeste. Hi, my name is Brianna Soleyn. I'm an ally board member of East New York Community Land Trust. And next slide. So who is East New York CLT? We're a grassroots organizing effort based in East New York, Brooklyn. We're made up of residents, allies of the neighborhood. We're homeowners, renters, entrepreneurs, allies, all volunteers and members that care about social housing and care about East New York. We're focused on gaining community control of city-owned lots in East New York and instituting real community planning in the neighborhood. So development based on like resident will. Next slide. So I'll go into a little bit about how a CLT works. A CLT is a nonprofit that owns and stewards land. Importantly, on the board of the nonprofit sits residents of the neighborhood, residents of the structures that sit on community land trust owned land, and also ally board members that are aligned with the mission of the CLT. So in this way, it protects the affordability clauses and keeps the land affordable in perpetuity and stabilizes the neighborhood. So a CLT gives away or leases the land that it stewards with typically a 99-year lease. That way the structure can be passed down to inheritors. And the terms of the lease institutes affordability clauses so that if it's sold, it can't be sold for a huge profit. And it passes down the affordability to the next generation. This allows for stability in residency and control over new development, and importantly, control over speculation in the neighborhood. And we've also increasingly come to see CLTs as a tool for being able to stabilize low-income home ownership in the neighborhood. So homeowners who need help rehabbing their home or are in a huge amount of municipal debt. We've been working on amending the way the city does the tax lien sale to include partnership with CLTs to stabilize low-income homeownership. And this graphic here comes from Nicely, New York City Community Land Trust Initiative, which is the coalition of community land trusts in the city. We saw a real increase in bolstering of CLT movement in the city in 2019, when the city council gave funding for staff to help incubate new CLTs. So our CLT was started in 2019. We were incubated by CHLDC. Work with our staff person, Hannah Anouche. CHLDC is a nonprofit developer in East New York who has a really strong track record of affordable rental development. So next slide. And I thought it'd be important to include our mission here. I'll read it. Planning and development in East New York should be led by us, for us, the longtime Black and Brown residents. We are organizing and building power so that public land remains in public hands. And that really sums it up. I thought it'd be important to ground this conversation in other organizing, faith-based organizing that happened in East New York. So the Nehemiah homes were organized by a group called East Brooklyn Congregations in the early 80s. And that took, they worked with the city to take city-owned vacant lots and push to create really deeply affordable home ownership opportunities to fight the type of deterioration we see in this photo in the left. Deterioration and abandonment that happened in the decades prior. They were able to work with the city to secure financing to build really affordable homes like in the 30K to 35K range that was accessible to low and middle income East New Yorkers. That was successful, but the market that these were built in is really different from the market today. I don't know how familiar people are with the East New York rezoning of 2016, but it attracted a huge amount of speculative investment to the neighborhood. So that this Nehemiah home that we see on the right, between May 2017 and March 2018, it was purchased by a real estate LLC for $175K and sold for $740K. So that's unacceptable, and it's the type of speculation that we're looking to intervene in. We know what will happen unless we make proactive steps to stop this type of gentrification and to make sure that affordable home ownership options are available to the next generation of Black East New Yorkers who were particularly affected by the foreclosure crisis and the housing crisis. So next slide. And since the 1990s, the city has given away a lot of its vacant public-owned land to private developers for free. And they've built housing that's not really affordable, that's not affordable to the area median incomes of neighborhoods like East New York, or the affordability clauses expire in 30 to 60 years. So that's not good enough. And we need to make sure these city-owned vacant lots are put under community control and remain affordable in perpetuity. So these are some examples of city-owned lot transfers to CLTs in the city, just to show what's possible. And the organizing that East New York's done so far since we started to kind of realize this vision, we've surveyed 255 city-owned lots. We've gotten community feedback about what needs to be built there through one-on-one surveys. We've hired an architect, Nandini Bagchi, to realize community vision for these sites. We've campaigned around equitable housing and land use legislation on a citywide level, and I'll go more into that later. And we've put in a lot of care and time into building out our board structure, our membership structure, working with lawyers to get our ground leases correct so that once we are more developed and we actually own land, it's in line with our mission. So the next slide. So this is just an example of one of the lots that we've identified that we'd like to build on. This would be a community center on the ground level and low-income rental on the top, and it's owned by HPD, but it's just sitting vacant in East New York. And the next slide. This is another backup site that we'd like to acquire. It's also owned by HPD, but the local precinct, the 75th precinct, park their personal cars on the lot. and it's a site owned by Housing Preservation Department. And we address practices like that in our black paper. Can you go to the next slide? Our NYPD black paper. So we wrote a black paper, not a white paper. It's a policy paper that takes a critical look of over-resourcing of city-owned land to the New York Police Department. And that's especially common practice in East New York, or places that were historically disinvested like Bushwick and the Bronx. And I talked a little bit about how to work with low-income homeowners, but that work's being done through the Ending the Tax Lien Sale Coalition. So currently the city sells municipal debt of homeowners to private trusts that's speculatively invested by vulture investors. So we're looking to end that practice and create a new model that works with CLTs so that low-income homeowners can stay in their homes, not have these fees tacked on that like worsens the debt that they're in, and find a way to keep their homes affordable in the neighborhood for the next generation. We're also working on COPA, Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which would prioritize CLTs and nonprofit developers in the selling of private land. Public land disposition would prioritize CLTs and nonprofits in the RFPs of publicly owned lots. Public banking would set up a public bank that the city's funds can go into. Currently, they go into private banks like Morgan Stanley that doesn't have the best track record with Black and brown communities. And we're also fighting for the Jewel Streets area of East New York. It's an area on the border of East New York and Queens that's been neglected by the city for decades. It's sunken in. It used to be like a swampy area. So it's way below sea level. It floods horrifically every time it rains. It's not connected to the sewer lines, and these are tax-paying property owners, so they're not getting these municipal services. So we've been fighting with them and the city to get more resources to that area. And the next slide. So join us, reach out to us if you have any more questions, if you want to be involved. If you're a faith-based group in East New York and you're looking to partner with the Community Land Trust to have community-led development on your land, reach out to us. Thanks.
Thanks, Brianna. Okay, I'm going to pass it to Monica Dean from LISC NYC to talk about the New York Land Opportunity Program.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Brianna, Celeste, and Sam for this panel this afternoon. So the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC, we are LISC New York, but LISC is a national nonprofit community development financial institution. So we are a CDFI that works with underserved communities with capital strategy and technical know-how to become places where low and moderate income people can really thrive. And so LISC, we've been around for a little over 40 years. We were created in 1980. We have 38 offices across the country, and I am happy to be a part of the team here at LISC New York. Next slide. So happy to talk to you briefly about our New York Land Opportunity Program, which we refer to as NYLOP. And so LISC started NYLOP back in 2017 And what NILOP was designed to do is to really partner with mission-driven organizations and faith-based organizations to help promote community economic development over the years. And so basically, what that means is we work with these organizations who own land and they want to develop an affordable housing component on the land that they own. And so while the mission-driven organizations and the faith-based organizations have many, vital resources that can contribute to these goals. They include, but are not limited to, the community relationships and leadership, land in high opportunity areas, and tax exempt status. Next slide, please. And so the components of our NILOP program really, again, was designed to have the organizations that are a part of the program or participating in our cohorts work with a team of experts, including architects and attorneys, where these experts work one-on-one with these organizations to learn more about their mission, conduct assessments of their land, the property that they own. And, we really want to ensure that these projects that we work with these organizations to develop are really aligned with their missions, and that they are involved in the process from the very beginning until the construction has been completed. And so we've established what we call 5 critical path milestones that we seek to accomplish before the end of the program. I always attend with the team. We go out to the sites, we conduct site visits, we conduct organizational assessments, and that includes meeting with the leadership at these organizations. We complete a very due diligence review of the organization, as well as the site. We develop organizational and financial structures for the participants in the program. They work with our architects who are part of the team to develop conceptual site plans for the property that they own. And we also work with them to select a development partner if needed. We're actually planning to release in January 9th, actually, of 2023. I'm putting out an RFP for master developer on behalf of Bethany Baptist Church and another one of our cohort members. So that's a brief overview about the components of the program. Next slide, please. The requirements to be considered for the New York Land Opportunity Program, requires them that, they're incorporated as a nonprofit corporation, that they have actual ownership or long-term leasehold for the vacant or underutilized property that's suitable for affordable housing, and that they have a track record of providing, services to their communities in which they are located. And so I am super excited to have join with me this afternoon Deacon Stephen Robinson of Bethany Baptist Church, who is going to share with you firsthand his perspective about working with LISC in this program. Bethany Baptist Church is located in the Harlem section of Manhattan. They were founded in 1932. And so they've been around for quite some time and provide a range of different services in that community over the years. So Deacon Robinson, I'm gonna ask you to take a couple of minutes and just share with the group here, just your own perspective and feedback as to how it's been with Bethany Baptist Church working with LISC New York in our NILOP program.
Thank you, Monica. Again, I want to say that I am so excited about what we have been able to accomplish with LISC in these past few months. We were excited to be one of the ones that were selected to be a part of the cohorts that you're working with this year. And we have found it to be very rewarding because of the services that you have, quite frankly, made available to us that we wouldn't necessarily have on our own. It's also very pleasant to have someone that worked with us that we feel comfortable with, that will working, that, so to speak, working for us rather than against us, and with us, that to help us to accomplish what we would like to see happen with the property that we own. We were very impressed that LISC was, and the people that work with LISC was there to listen to what we wanted to have developed, what we wanted to use the property for, and incorporated that in the plans that we have been working with going forward. So we are very thankful that LISC is there available for us, and we appreciate that you can't often find this type of assistance where they care about what you want to do. They're very cognitive of the fact that the church has some special needs as opposed to some other organizations, and there's some things that we want to have developed even within the project. So we were very happy with the fact that we were able to get architects and the lawyers on board, and even some funding to help the pre-development. So we are very thankful, and this has been a very pleasant experience, and we're looking forward to developing the project that we have developed. It started off as a smaller project, and it's seeming to develop into a larger one, where we are going to be able to provide more affordable housing. And that's one of the things that we have always tried to do at Bethany from the very beginning. You might know that we have 2 senior 202 housing, and we have a multifamily project building, and this just will fit right into what we would like to do for this new project that we're working with. Monica, I want to say publicly thank you for your assistance in all that we're doing. And anyone wants to know more about how it worked with us and for us, you're welcome to speak with us, and we'll share our information with you as well.
Thank you so much, Deacon Robinson, for that. It's been a pleasure to work with you and your team. And so, as Deacon Robinson just shared, we had a series of meetings and conversations. We took into consideration when selecting the team of experts, the architects and the attorneys, that we needed to make sure we had the right team that could work with our cohort. And so that too was very important to us. And so I want to thank you for joining us and sharing your perspective about NILOB. And I'll turn it back over to you, Celeste and Henry.
Thank you so much, Monica. And Deacon Robinson. I think we have one question in the chat thus far. I just wanted to ask anybody else to drop any questions in the chat for the panelists about their presentations. I think the first question we had is from Doreen Mohammed.
Doreen, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Hi. Yes. Yeah. Hi. My name is Doreen. My question is for Sam Stein, the presentation he gave. So you were talking about the circles on the graph show how much democratic control there is. And, obviously we can see that public housing is arguably the best option and the one at the top, but the circle isn't as big because with these privatization efforts with Rad Pact and the trust and all of that, that is eroding what's arguably the best foundational housing like supply for, especially for most marginalized New Yorkers who are Black and brown. And right now with the trust voting process, it was like they only wanted 10% of residents to vote on whether they can have it privatized or not, like the Rad Pact option, the trust option, or stay as is. And also like they're holding the necessary repair things over them. It just got changed to 20%. So clearly this is not democratically controlled, like allowing NYCHA in New York City to privatize or use these schemes isn't good. So I wanted to kind of hear your perspective and like what, you know, we as a movement should be doing to make sure NYCHA stays public and gets the funding it needs for these repairs, you know?
Yeah, thanks for that, Doreen. I mean, first of all, I think there were limits imposed by the federal government on resident control of public housing before any of these conversions were on the table, right? Like residents should have had a stronger voice in public housing in the first place. And there was a lot, you know, residents have a federally recognized right to organize and elect resident leaders, but then what those resident leaders have control over is fairly limited. So I think we need to be more expansive in what we're pushing for. Like, I agree, we need to be pushing for the maximum democratic participation of residents in public housing, but I think it can go much further than what we had as the status quo. Some residents are, you know, looking at the resident management corporation model. I'm sorry, is that right? RMC. Which is one way that residents can have more control over public housing while keeping it fully public housing. That model has existed as an option for a very long time, but I think it's only been exercised maybe once in New York City. There's also a lot of risks involved in that, given how in debt NYCHA has become. So taking control of public housing at the time when its resources are severely constrained would be like, you know, democracy in form, but not in practice. So we want to go further. We want to go further than the model has existed in the past and give residents the most control over their housing. Public housing is a great model of residents having the right to organize and elect their own leaders. That's different than what exists in a lot of other housing stocks. And we've been looking at what it would look like to have, for example, in rent stabilized housing, a right to organize and a right to have resident associations, tenant associations recognized by the landlords and force them to collectively bargain in a way that's sort of parallel to, hopefully better than, the National Labor Relations Act, which forces employers to recognize workers when they come together, form a union, and then collectively bargain. So this sort of realm of resident control in rental housing, I think is something we should be pushing in all forms of rental housing.
So yeah, kind
Thanks,
of as
Sam.
a follow-up, because
I just want we only have like 6 minutes, Doreen. I just want to get to the one other question, and then if we have time, I'll come back. Is that okay?
Okay.
Thank you. So Matt Dunbar put in the chat, is NILAP, this is a question for Monica, is NILAP also accessible for faith communities in Westchester County, or is it at this point limited to New York City?
So this iteration of NILAP is specifically limited to New York City, but we are looking at this current iteration of NILAP to launch a statewide NILAP in 2023. So we have an office in Western New York. So we have a LISC Western New York office as well. And so they are working with faith-based groups there, providing some similar services, but it's not like an official NILAP program. Some of my developers from another housing program that I manage, which is called the Developers of Color Training Program, are doing some faith-based work in Western New York, so in Buffalo and Rochester. And so we are, working, we're talking, we support one another. but Matt, I'd be happy to connect you, with our LISC Western New York office again, who are working with faith-based groups, and quite a few of my developers are down there doing some development work as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Monica. Are there any other questions from people who haven't had a chance to ask yet?
I actually had,
Go ahead.
if other participants have something on their mind, I don't want to jump in, but I don't know, I'm not sure, Brianna, are you still, you're off camera?
I'm still here.
Oh, okay, good. So I had a question that was like, I guess mostly for Brianna, but also for any of the other panelists to chime in. I just was really struck in the photos that you shared. It just was a powerful image to see the vacant lots in the neighborhood, including like in the sort of before photo from the Nehemiah houses, but then also the photos of the land that your organization is working to own and develop. And this might sound like a dumb question, but like, frankly, like I live in a more privileged part of New York where there's not like vacant lots all over the place. And it just strikes me, I'm just wondering, like, what does that do to the feeling of the neighborhood and the feeling of the community if there's all this like undeveloped and unmaintained land? It just seems like a kind of environmental hazard and a kind of emotional issue for the community.
Yeah, that's a good point. And people notice it. Like you notice that your neighborhood's neglected and that you feel like no one's paying attention to your area. So one of the first actions that we did was a community lot cleanup day, because there's a lot of dumping on these vacant lots, like people dump their trash there. And I think that was just, I hadn't joined the organization there, but reflecting on it, that's just a method of like having neighbors feel like they have control over these places that like have been functionally like neglected for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for sharing those photos. It really like added more texture to the conversation.
Yeah, and I'll just add that a lot of the times vacant lots in disinvested neighborhoods are not just sort of like open and out there, but they're fenced off, which is the worst of both worlds, right? It is neither being put toward the use that people need it, but also it prevents people from going in and reclaiming it, right? Like we have a history of community gardens, for example, in vacant lots. That's a lot harder to do when these are fenced off and policed than, when they're open and available.
Yeah, that's such a good point. A lot of the times, like when we're doing our actions, we hang our signs on the fence, we like tie a ribbon with like an explanation of what you want to see on the lot instead of what's there, like the dumping, the overgrown grass. And that's just a way of people feeling like they have ownership from these spaces that they've been closed off from. And I want to mention an action that Picture the Homeless did in, I think it was like maybe 2011. They actually took over a city-owned lot. They broke in and had like a community day in the lot. Like, yeah. Sam, do you remember it? Do you remember that?
I can think of one that may or may not have been that action. I think, they did it a few times, and there was one that was associated and during Occupy Wall Street in East New York as well.
Ronaldo?
Yeah, this is a question related to your presentation too, Brianna. You mentioned in East Harlem, there are community land trusts or were, and I'm wondering if you know a little bit about that, because I think maybe I misunderstood, but I think you mentioned that they've kind of gradually become something else, or they're falling out of like control from the people who originally had the trust. I'm just wondering if you could say more about that. And
They're up and active. They're
I'm
up
sorry,
and active, and they
Brianna and
yeah.
Ronaldo, I totally apologize. I don't want to be the bossy timekeeper, but we have to go back to the main room in like literally a minute. So Brianna, if you could answer as quickly as possible. And again,
they are active, they have land, they just got land buildings from the city that they're in the process of getting funding to rehabilitate.
Thank you.
If I could just I know it's gonna be quick, but I'm still a little confused as to how the blueprint and the trust will promote more democratically controlled and good public housing stuff. Like Sam, I'm still not, that I think is, I believe you and your org supported it, so that's why I'm genuinely confused as someone that works in that space.
What do I have, like 20 seconds? I mean, so what I would say is what I'm talking about is converting for-profit housing into social housing. I'm not talking about public housing conversions. I do think that the blueprint and the trust are qualitatively different than RAD, even if what we might support is, Section 9 public housing. I don't think that they're the same, but, probably at time now, happy to talk more offline.
Okay, I'll put my email in the chat.
I'm muted. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you to our panelists for giving such great presentations.